The ultimatum echoed through the damp, pine-scented walls of the Blackwood pack house, leaving no room for negotiation. Choose your mate tonight, Alara, or we will choose for you. At 22, Alara Hayes was viewed as a defective outcast, an orphaned nurse slated to be given to the pack's cruelest enforcer to breed. She stood trembling on the bonfire stage, surrounded by jeering wolves, waiting for her life to end. But as the heavy oak doors of the courtyard slammed open, the air pressure plummeted. The Alpha King himself had just crossed the threshold, and his golden eyes were locked entirely on her. The fluorescent lights of the Blackwood Pack Clinic hummed a low, irritating buzz that did nothing to soothe the pounding ache behind Alara Hayes' eyes. She scrubbed her hands raw over the stainless steel sink, watching the pale pink water swirl down the drain. It had been a long shift. Being an unmated, low-ranking wolf in a pack stationed in the isolated, rugged mountains of the Pacific Northwest meant she was given the grunt work. She stitched up drunken bar fight wounds, administered antibiotics to the elderly wolves, and kept her head down. It was a strategy of survival. But today, survival was no longer on the table. Today was her 22nd birthday. In the modern world outside the pack's vast forested borders, 22 was an age of college degrees, terrible dates, and newfound independence. Inside the Blackwood Pack, however, it marked the expiration of a female's grace period. According to the ancient, archaic laws fiercely upheld by Alpha Gregory Walsh, any female who had not found her fated mate by her 22nd year was deemed a pack asset. She would be assigned a mate to ensure the continuation of strong bloodlines. It was a clinical, bureaucratic term for forced breeding. Alara, a soft voice interrupted her thoughts. Alara looked up at the mirror to see Chloe, a fellow nurse and one of her only friends, standing in the doorway. Chloe's face was pale, her hands wringing the hem of her scrubs. "Gregory's enforcers are here," Chloe whispered, her eyes darting nervously down the hallway. "They're waiting for you in the lobby. They said it's time." A cold weight dropped into Alara's stomach. She dried her hands on a paper towel, her movements mechanically slow. "I thought I had until tonight. The ceremony isn't until the moon is high. Gregory wants to see you now." In his office, Chloe said, stepping forward to give Alara's arm a comforting, albeit trembling, squeeze. "Be careful, Alara. I saw Silas Miller walk in there 10 minutes ago." Alara's breath hitched. Silas. He was the pack's lead enforcer, a hulking, scarred brute of a man who treated women like property and lesser wolves like target practice. He had been eyeing Alara for years, his predatory gaze tracking her every move whenever she crossed the pack square. She stripped off her scrubs, revealing a simple pair of jeans and a gray sweater, and walked down the linoleum hallway. Every step felt like walking to her own execution. Alpha Gregory Walsh's office was located in the main pack house, a sprawling, modern mansion built of glass and dark timber. When Alara was ushered through the heavy mahogany doors, the stench of stale cigar smoke, expensive bourbon, and overpowering alpha pheromones hit her like a physical blow. Her inner wolf, usually dormant and quiet, whined in submission, forcing Alara to lower her gaze. Gregory sat behind a massive oak desk. He was a man in his late 50s, his silver hair slicked back, wearing a tailored suit that mocked the primal beast lurking beneath his skin. Leaning against the bookshelf to his right was Silas, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. On the left sat Derek Foster, an older, wealthy pack elder who had buried 3 wives under mysterious circumstances. "Alara," Gregory said, not bothering to offer her a seat. He steepled his fingers, his dark eyes assessing her like livestock at an auction. "Happy birthday." "Alpha," Alara murmured, keeping her neck respectfully bowed. "You summoned me. We are here to discuss your future. As you know, the mating moon ceremony is tonight. You are 22, unmated, and the last of the Hayes bloodline. Your parents were good soldiers before the rogue attack took them, and the pack has fed and housed you since you were 10. Now, it is time to repay that debt." Alara swallowed the lump in her throat. "I repay it every day at the clinic, Alpha. I work 60-hour weeks. I save lives." "You are a nurse," Gregory cut her off smoothly, his voice devoid of warmth. "A useful trade, but not your primary duty to this pack. Our numbers are dwindling. We need strong pups. The elders and I have reviewed your genetic chart. You are healthy. You are a prime candidate for a breeding assignment." Alara's nails dug into her palms until she felt the sting of breaking skin. "I want to wait for my fated mate." Silas let out a harsh barking laugh, pushing himself off the bookshelf. "You're 22, sweetheart. If you had a fated mate, you'd have found him by now. Your wolf is practically dead inside you anyway. You need a real alpha to wake it up." He took a step toward her, and Alara had to fight the overwhelming urge to step back. "Silas is right," Gregory said, opening a leather-bound folder on his desk. "The grace period is over, so we are giving you a rare privilege. You get to choose. You can accept Silas, who has generously offered to take you as his chosen mate, or you can choose Derek, who will provide you with a life of luxury in exchange for an heir." Alara looked at Derek, whose eyes were roaming over her body with a sick, possessive hunger, and then at Silas, who was practically vibrating with violent anticipation. "And if I refuse both?" Alara asked, her voice shaking but her chin rising a fraction of an inch. "If I refuse to be treated like an incubator?" The room went deadly silent. Gregory's eyes hardened, the veneer of the civilized businessman slipping to reveal the ruthless alpha beneath. The air grew heavy, pressing down on Alara's chest until she could barely draw breath. "Then you will be stripped of your rank," Gregory said softly, a deadly edge to his tone. "You will be cast down to Omega, stripped of your job at the clinic, and placed in the communal breeding program. You won't belong to one wolf. You will belong to anyone who pays the fee. Choose your mate tonight, Alara, or we will choose for you." Tears pricked the corners of Alara's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She was trapped. She had no family, no money, and nowhere to run. A lone wolf in the wilderness was as good as dead, hunted down by rogues or rival packs. "You have until midnight at the bonfire," Gregory commanded, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. "Wear something presentable." By 11 o'clock that night, the Blackwood Pack Square was practically vibrating with frenzied energy. The mating moon ceremony was an ancient, primal affair. Massive bonfires roared, sending showers of orange sparks up into the ink-black star-studded sky. The air was thick with the scent of roasting meat, cheap beer, and the overwhelming, musky pheromones of hundreds of werewolves desperate to find a match. Alara stood on the periphery of the light, her arms wrapped tightly around her waist. She had changed into a simple dark green dress, nothing too flashy, but formal enough to avoid a punishment for insubordination. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Every passing minute was a countdown to her doom. Across the fire, she saw Silas drinking from a red plastic cup, laughing with his enforcer buddies. He pointed a finger at her, said something to the group, and they all threw their heads back in crude laughter. He was already celebrating. He knew she had no real choice. Derek was a monster hiding behind money, but Silas would at least keep the other wolves away from her, even if he made her life a private hell. "It's time," a harsh voice barked. One of Gregory's guards grabbed Alara's arm, his grip bruising, and dragged her toward the raised wooden platform at the center of the square. The drums that had been beating a rhythmic pulse all night suddenly stopped. The crowd fell silent, their glowing eyes turning toward the stage. Alpha Gregory stepped up to the microphone, looking regal in the firelight. "Tonight, we honor the moon goddess," he roared, met with a chorus of enthusiastic howls. "We honor strength, we honor legacy, and we enforce our laws to ensure the Blackwood Pack remains formidable." He gestured to Alara, and the guard shoved her forward so she stumbled into the center of the stage, utterly exposed. The heat of the fire scorched her skin, but inside, she was ice cold. "Alara Hayes has reached the end of her grace period," Gregory announced, his voice booming over the speakers. "She stands before the pack tonight to make her choice. Silas Miller, step forward. Derek Foster, step forward." The two men climbed onto the stage, flanking her like vultures. "Alara," Gregory demanded, stepping closer. "Speak your choice. Who will claim you?" Alara opened her mouth, but her throat was completely dry. She looked out at the sea of faces, people she had healed, neighbors she had known since childhood. None of them met her eyes. They were complicit in this barbarism. She looked at Silas, who was grinning, his fangs subtly descending in anticipation. Alara started, a tear finally escaping and tracing a hot path down her cheek. "I choose." Boom. The sound was like a thunderclap, echoing so violently through the valley that the ground beneath the stage literally shuddered. The heavy, reinforced steel gates at the entrance of the Pack Square gates, designed to withstand a rogue siege, were suddenly blown off their hinges, crashing onto the pavement in a twisted heap of metal. The pack erupted into chaos. Wolves began to shift, the sounds of snapping bones and deep guttural growls filling the night as the enforcers rushed forward to defend the territory. Gregory's eyes widened in fury, his claws extending, but the growls died in their throats almost instantly. A suffocating, terrifying aura swept over the square. It was an alpha command so potent, so ancient and raw, that it bypassed the logical brain and struck straight at the wolves' spinal cords. All around Alara, wolves were dropping to their knees. Enforcers, elders, and commoners alike collapsed, whining, their faces pressed to the dirt. Even Gregory was forced down to one knee, sweating profusely, his teeth gritted in a desperate battle against the oppressive power. Alara remained standing. Strangely, the oppressive weight didn't hurt her. It felt warm, like a sudden rush of electricity waking up her dormant soul. Her inner wolf, which had been silent for a decade, suddenly clawed at her mind, pacing, howling in a strange, desperate ecstasy. Mate, mate, mate. Through the smoke of the bonfire emerged a contingent of men in immaculate black suits. They moved with military precision, forming a vanguard. And from the center of this elite guard walked a man who made the world stop spinning. Alexander Sterling, the Alpha King. He was a legend, a myth whispered about in terrified tones. He ruled all the packs in the Western Hemisphere from a sprawling, untouchable estate in New York. He was known as a ruthless businessman and an even more merciless warrior. A man who had slaughtered the rebellious Southern Alphas without breaking a sweat. He hadn't visited a regional pack in person in over 5 years. Alexander was breathtakingly lethal. He stood over 6'4", broad-shouldered, radiating an authority that demanded absolute worship. His dark hair was perfectly styled, but his eyes, pure, glowing, molten gold, were entirely wild. He didn't look at Gregory. He didn't look at the kneeling enforcers. He was looking directly at Alara. Alexander stalked through the parted crowd, his expensive leather shoes silent on the dirt. The scent rolling off him hit Alara like a tidal wave, petrichor, dark cedar, and the sharp tang of ozone before a lightning storm. It was the most intoxicating thing she had ever inhaled. Her lungs expanded, drinking him in, as her body swayed involuntarily toward him. He stepped onto the wooden stage. Silas, who was trembling violently but stubbornly trying to stay on his feet to assert his claim, stepped between Alara and the king. Sire, Silas stammered, trying to puff out his chest. This female is spoken for. She is mine. Alexander didn't even blink. He didn't raise his voice. He simply backhanded Silas. The casual flick of the king's wrist connected with a sickening crack, lifting the 250-pound enforcer off his feet and throwing him off the stage, where he crashed into the dirt, unconscious before he even landed. Gregory gasped, struggling to rise from his knee. Your Majesty, what is the meaning of this? Why have you come to Blackwood? Alexander ignored the local alpha entirely. He closed the remaining distance between himself and Alara. Up close, he was even more devastating. The hard, angular lines of his jaw softened slightly as he looked down at her. His chest was heaving, his pupils blown wide, swallowing the gold until his eyes were almost entirely black. He slowly reached up, his large, calloused hand gently tracing the line of her jaw, his thumb brushing away the lone tear that had fallen on her cheek. The contrast of his immense, terrifying power and the absolute reverence of his touch sent a violent shiver down Alara's spine. Mine, Alexander breathed, his voice a deep, gravelly vibration that rattled her very bones. He turned his head slowly, his golden eyes fixing on Gregory with a look of murderous, unbridled wrath. You dared to put my mate on an auction block, the Alpha King whispered, the quietness of his voice far more terrifying than a roar. Tonight, Blackwood will burn. The silence that followed the Alpha King's proclamation was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the massive bonfire. The flames cast dancing, demonic shadows across the dirt square of the Blackwood pack, illuminating the absolute terror etched into the faces of the kneeling wolves. Alara stood frozen against Alexander Sterling's side. The sheer heat radiating from his massive frame was the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. His customized Brioni suit jacket brushed against her bare arm, the fine Italian wool a stark contrast to the rough, violent world she had known her entire life. Your Majesty, please, Alpha Gregory Walsh finally choked out, his forehead pressed against the dirt. The oppressive weight of Alexander's aura was forcing the local Alpha to hyperventilate. We had no idea. Her records. She is a low-ranking nurse, an orphan. If we had known she was the destined queen, we would have protected her with our lives. Alexander's laugh was a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated through Alara's chest. He didn't let go of her. Instead, he pulled her slightly behind him, shielding her from the predatory, albeit terrified, eyes of the pack. "You would have protected her?" Alexander repeated, his voice dangerously soft. He took a single measured step toward Gregory. "You put my mate on a wooden stage like cattle. You threatened to throw her to your rabid enforcers if she did not submit to forced breeding. Do not insult my intelligence, Gregory. I smell the greed and the cheap bourbon sweating out of your pores." Alexander raised his right hand, and the contingent of royal guards' flawlessly dressed operatives who looked more like elite private military contractors than wolves snapped to attention. "Harrison," Alexander called out, his golden eyes never leaving Gregory. A tall, broad-shouldered man with striking gray eyes stepped forward from the vanguard. Harrison was the king's beta, a ruthless tactician known throughout the North American packs. "Sire," Harrison replied, bowing his head. "Secure the perimeter. No one leaves this valley. I want a full audit of the Blackwood Pack's financials, their border patrols, and their medical records," Alexander commanded, his tone all strictly business, stripping away the primal beast just enough to reveal the ruthless CEO of the Sterling Empire. "And arrest Derek Foster. I know about the missing trust funds from his previous 3 wives. I want him in a holding cell at Rikers by sunrise." Derek, the wealthy elder who had been leering at Alara only moments before, let out a pathetic shriek as 2 royal guards hauled him up by his armpits, dragging him away from the bonfire without a single ounce of respect for his local status. Gregory finally managed to push himself up onto his knees, his face pale and slick with sweat. "You cannot do this, King Alexander. Blackwood is a sovereign territory under the Seattle Accords. You have no right to strip my authority without a tribunal." Alexander let go of Alara's hand for just a fraction of a second. He moved with a speed that defied the human eye. One moment he was standing beside her, and the next, his hand was wrapped around Gregory's throat, lifting the local alpha clean off the ground. Gregory's legs kicked wildly in the air, his hands clawing uselessly at the king's iron grip. "I am the tribunal," Alexander snarled, his fangs fully descended, gleaming in the firelight. The gold in his eyes flared, burning with an ancient, untamed fury. "You violated the most sacred law of our kind. You tried to force a mating upon a female against her will. You are stripped of your alpha title. Your assets are seized by the crown. If you ever step foot near my mate again, I will tear your heart from your chest and feed it to the crows. Do you understand me?" Gregory couldn't speak, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple, but he managed a frantic, jerky nod. Alexander dropped him. Gregory hit the dirt like a sack of dead weight, gasping and coughing violently. The king turned his back on the disgraced alpha, the violence draining from his posture the second his eyes met Alara's. The transition was so abrupt it gave her whiplash. The murderous, untouchable monarch vanished, replaced by a man looking at her with such profound, desperate devotion that Alara felt the breath knock out of her lungs. He shrugged off his dark suit jacket, leaving him in a crisp white Tom Ford dress shirt that stretched over his muscular torso. Gently, reverently, he draped the jacket over Alara's shoulders. The silk lining still held his body heat, and the scent of dark cedar and ozone enveloped her, instantly soothing the frantic pacing of her newly awakened inner wolf. "Are you hurt, Mokrowi?" he asked, his voice a rough whisper meant only for her. The old Gaelic term of endearment slipped out naturally, a stark contrast to his modern, polished exterior. Alara shook her head slowly, pulling the lapels of his jacket closer together. "No, just shocked." "How did you know?" "I've been looking for you for 5 years, Alexander said, his eyes tracing the contours of her face as if memorizing a masterpiece. "I felt the pull snap into place 20 minutes ago when the moon hit its peak. I was in Seattle for a summit. We barely made it." He swallowed hard, his jaw clenching. "Let's get you out of this filth." He placed a protective hand on the small of her back. The touch sent a jolt of electricity straight down her spine. As he guided her through the parted sea of kneeling wolves, Alara didn't look back at the clinic, at Chloe, or at the life she was leaving behind. For the first time in 22 years, she felt entirely, undeniably safe. The convoy waiting just outside the pack borders was a testament to the king's staggering wealth and paranoia. A fleet of 6 matte black, heavily armored Chevrolet Suburbans idled on the gravel road, flanking a massive Mercedes-Maybach S680 Guard. The vehicles looked completely alien against the backdrop of the rugged, untamed Washington pines. Harrison opened the heavy rear door of the Maybach, bowing slightly as Alexander guided Alara inside. The interior of the vehicle was a sanctuary of cream-colored leather, polished, burled walnut, and total silence. The heavy, bulletproof doors, shut with a solid thud, instantly cutting off the sounds of the wind and the distant howls of the Blackwood wolves. The glass partition separating the rear cabin from the driver was already raised, affording them absolute privacy. Alara sank into the plush leather, her knees finally giving out now that the immediate threat was gone. She pulled her knees to her chest, Alexander's oversized jacket swallowing her small frame. Alexander slid in beside her, though he kept a respectful distance. He seemed to sense that despite the mate bond tying their souls together, to Alara, he was still a terrifying stranger who had just dismantled her entire world in under 10 minutes. The convoy surged forward, the powerful engines purring as they navigated the winding mountain roads toward the private airfield in Seattle. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Alara watched the dark silhouettes of the trees blur past the tinted windows. Her mind was a chaotic storm. She was supposed to be in Silas's bed right now, or trapped in Derek's gilded cage. Instead, she was riding in a multi-million-dollar fortress, wearing the jacket of the Alpha King. She turned her head to look at him. Alexander was staring out his own window, his jaw tight. The dim, ambient lighting of the cabin caught the sharp, aristocratic lines of his profile. He was beautiful, in a harsh, predatory way, but as Alara's eyes drifted down to his chest, her trained medical instincts flared to life. Beneath the crisp, white fabric of his tailored shirt, just above his left ribcage, a dark, wet stain was slowly spreading. Alara sat up straighter, her fear momentarily eclipsed by her professional training. "You're bleeding." Alexander looked down at his side, as if just noticing the blood. He let out a dismissive sigh. "It's nothing, just a graze." "A graze?" Alara echoed, shifting closer across the leather seat. "Werewolves heal from standard lacerations in minutes. That stain is growing, which means you're actively bleeding. What hit you?" Alexander hesitated, his golden eyes flicking to her face, assessing her sudden shift in demeanor. The terrified, submissive girl from the bonfire was gone, replaced by the pragmatic, clinical nurse who had spent her life triaging injuries. It brought a faint, genuine smile to his lips. "There was an ambush at the summit in Seattle," Alexander admitted quietly. "A rogue faction funded by the Southern Alphas. They knew I was close to finding my mate. They tried to delay me. One of them had a high-caliber rifle loaded with silver-laced hollow points." Alara gasped, her hands instinctively reaching out before she could stop herself. Silver didn't just burn werewolves. It poisoned their bloodstream, actively fighting their regenerative cells. "You took a silver bullet and you still came to Blackwood? You should be in an intensive care unit." "I felt the bond snap," Alexander said simply, his gaze turning incredibly intense. "I felt your terror, Alara. I would have crawled through hellfire and broken glass to get to that courtyard before midnight. A bullet was not going to stop me." The raw, unfiltered honesty in his voice made her heart stutter. No one had ever fought for her. No one had ever prioritized her. To the Blackwood Pack, she was an asset. To the king, she was his entire world. "Take your shirt off," Alara ordered, the words slipping out before she could filter them. Alexander raised a dark eyebrow, a sudden, playful smirk cutting through his exhaustion. "My queen, we haven't even had our first date." A furious blush exploded across Alara's cheeks, heating her face all the way to the tips of her ears. "I am a nurse," she stammered, crossing her arms defensively, "and you have a silver wound that needs to be cleaned before the toxicity spreads to your heart. There has to be a first aid kit in this rolling tank." Alexander chuckled, a rich, deep sound that filled the cabin. He reached under his seat and pulled out a sleek, black medical case, setting it on the center console. "As you wish, Nurse Hayes." With agonizing slowness, he unbuttoned his shirt, wincing slightly as the fabric pulled away from the wound. Alara's breath caught in her throat. His torso was a map of hard, scarred muscle, a testament to a lifetime of brutal battles. Just below his pectoral muscle, an ugly, jagged gash was weeping dark blood, the edges of the wound tinged with the sickly gray and black of silver poisoning. Alara opened the medical kit, her hands perfectly steady now that she was in her element. She pulled out antiseptic, silver-neutralizing foam, and sterile gauze. "This is going to burn," she warned, leaning in close. The scent of hemp cedar, ozone, and now the sharp tang of copper was overwhelming, but she focused on the task. "I've had worse," Alexander murmured. As Alara applied the neutralizing foam, it hissed and bubbled against his skin. Alexander didn't even flinch. Instead, his golden eyes remained fixed on her face, watching her with a mixture of awe and heavy, possessive hunger. "You're very beautiful when you're bossing me around," he said quietly, his large hand coming up to gently rest on her knee. Elara paused, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked up, her gaze locking with his. The small cabin suddenly felt entirely too intimate. The air crackled with the undeniable, gravitational pull of the mate bond. "Where are we going, Alexander?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, using his given name for the first time. His thumb stroked a slow, rhythmic circle over her denim-clad knee. "We are going to my estate in New York. You will be protected, you will be crowned, and you will never, ever have to bow to anyone again." The descent into New York was a masterclass in modern aviation, but Elara's stomach remained stubbornly tied in knots. The Sterling family's private Gulfstream G650ER touched down smoothly on a secluded airstrip nestled deep within the Hudson Valley. Through the rain-streaked window, Elara caught her first glimpse of her new reality. The Sterling estate was not merely a house. It was a fortress of limestone, glass, and dark slate, sprawling across thousands of acres of ancient, untouched forest. It made the Blackwood pack house look like a dilapidated hunting cabin. As the jet's engines powered down, Alexander finally stepped back into the main cabin from the private office suite in the rear. He had spent the last 3 hours on encrypted satellite calls, ruthlessly dismantling Alpha Gregory's financial holdings and officially folding the Blackwood territory under direct crown control. He wore a fresh black dress shirt, his silver-poisoned wound professionally bound beneath it, though the tight clenching of his jaw betrayed a lingering stiffness. He extended a hand to Elara. "Welcome home." Elara placed her hand in his, the sheer size and warmth of his grip sending a fresh wave of static electricity up her arm. She stepped off the plane and into the biting chill of the New York autumn. A line of imposing guards, dressed in the same immaculate black suits as Harrison, flanked a convoy of armored SUVs. They bowed their heads in perfect, synchronized submission as Alexander led her past them. "They don't have to do that," Elara whispered, pulling Alexander's heavy jacket tighter around her shoulders. "They are acknowledging their queen," Alexander replied smoothly, his golden eyes scanning the perimeter with predatory precision. "You will need to get used to it, Mo Crowe. In this world, weakness is blood in the water. You must never lower your head to anyone here." His words proved terrifyingly prophetic the moment they crossed the threshold of the estate's grand foyer. The interior was a staggering display of wealth, vaulted ceilings adorned with Renaissance-style frescoes, sweeping dual staircases of imported white marble, and chandeliers that dripped with thousands of cut crystals. Waiting at the base of the stairs was a welcoming committee that felt more like a firing squad. At the center stood Vivienne Kensington. She was the daughter of the Eastern Seaboard's wealthiest alpha, a stunningly beautiful woman with sleek, platinum blonde hair, icy blue eyes, and a crimson silk dress that hugged every curve of her statuesque figure. Beside her stood Lord Nathaniel Croft, a silver-haired, stern-faced elder who served as the king's primary political advisor. "Alexander," Vivienne purred, stepping forward. She deliberately ignored Elara, focusing her intoxicating floral scent entirely on the king. "We were so worried. We heard rumors of an ambush in Seattle. And yet, here you are, bringing stray baggage into the estate." Vivienne's cold, blue eyes finally snapped to Elara, looking her up and down with naked disgust. She took in Elara's scuffed sneakers, her cheap denim jeans, and the fact that she was swimming in the king's oversized jacket. Elara's inner wolf, which had been pacing restlessly since the bonfire, suddenly snapped its jaws. A low, warning vibration built in Elara's chest, surprising her. For 22 years, she had been conditioned to submit to higher-ranking females. Now, a fierce, territorial anger spiked through her veins. "Vivienne," Alexander's voice dropped an octave, resonating with a lethal, vibrating bass that made the crystal chandeliers above them subtly rattle. "You will address her as Your Grace, or you will find yourself expelled from this territory before breakfast. This is Elara, my destined mate." Lord Nathaniel stepped forward, leaning heavily on a silver-topped cane, his brow furrowed in deep disapproval. "Sire, a private word. The council has been preparing for your union with the Kensington bloodline for 3 years. This abrupt change in succession will cause a diplomatic crisis. The girl has no pedigree. She smells of iodine and cheap clinic soap. She is an unranked commoner. She is my equal," Alexander snarled, his fangs flashing as he took a threatening step toward the elder. "If the council has a problem with the moon goddess's decree, they can take it up with my claws. Do not test my patience tonight, Nathaniel." Alara stepped forward, gently placing a hand on Alexander's tense bicep. The simple touch instantly grounded him, the lethal tension bleeding out of his shoulders. She looked directly at Lord Nathaniel, refusing to break eye contact. "I may be a commoner, Lord Nathaniel," Alara said, her voice remarkably steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. "But I have spent the last 6 years keeping wolves alive. I know the anatomy of our kind better than anyone in this room. I know exactly where to apply pressure to stop a hemorrhage, and I know exactly where to cut to cause one. Please do not mistake my lack of a pedigree for a lack of capability." The grand foyer went dead silent. Vivian's perfectly glossed lips parted in shock. Harrison, standing a few paces behind them, let out a low, approving chuckle. Alexander looked down at Alara, his golden eyes blazing with absolute, unadulterated pride. He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a lingering kiss to her knuckles without breaking eye contact with his stunned advisors. "Prepare the royal wing," Alexander ordered, his tone leaving no room for debate, "and inform the court that there will be a formal presentation banquet tomorrow evening. They have 24 hours to accept their new queen, or they can pack their bags." As Alexander led her up the sweeping marble staircase, Alara felt the heated, venomous glares of Vivian and Nathaniel burning into her back. The Alpha King had claimed her, but the war for her survival had only just begun. The Blackwood Pack had threatened her with physical violence, but this gilded cage was filled with vipers who fought with politics, poison, and sabotage. The royal wing of the Sterling estate was a sprawling penthouse of modern luxury, offering panoramic views of the dark, sweeping forests of the Hudson Valley. But for Alara, the entire day leading up to the presentation banquet felt like a surreal, terrifying fever dream. A small army of stylists and seamstresses had descended upon her at dawn, scrubbing her skin with crushed pearl exfoliants, taming her wild hair into elegant, cascading waves, and outfitting her in a breathtaking, custom-made gown of midnight blue velvet. The dress featured a daring neckline and a sweeping train, making her look every inch the regal monarch Alexander demanded the world see. Yet, beneath the velvet and diamonds, Alara felt a strange, simmering heat building in her blood. Her senses were dialed to an agonizing 11. She could hear the distinct heartbeats of the guards stationed 3 floors down. She could smell the incoming rainstorm hours before the clouds had even formed. When Alexander arrived to escort her to the banquet, he literally stopped in his tracks. He wore a perfectly tailored midnight blue tuxedo that matched her gown, looking like a dark, devastating god of war. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, his hands spanning her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. "You are going to bring this court to its knees," he murmured, burying his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling her scent deeply. "If anyone looks at you too long tonight, I might have to gauge their eyes out." Alara managed a breathless laugh, her hands resting flat against his solid chest. "Let's aim for a bloodless evening, Alexander. I don't want to spend my first night as queen triaging your courtiers." The grand ballroom was a spectacle of excessive opulence. Hundreds of the continent's most powerful alphas, betas, and political elites were gathered, dripping in jewels and sizing each other up over crystal flutes of champagne. When the heavy mahogany doors opened, and the herald announced the king and his new queen, the ambient chatter died instantly. Every eye turned to Alara. She felt the crushing weight of their collective scrutiny, the silent, judgmental assessments of her worth. But with Alexander's hand resting firmly on the small of her back, radiating a fierce, protective heat, she kept her chin high. The evening was a grueling marathon of veiled insults and forced smiles. Alara navigated the treacherous conversations with surprising grace, utilizing the bedside manner she had honed for years in the clinic to deflect prying questions. But she couldn't shake the persistent, localized anxiety humming beneath her skin. Her newly awakened wolf was pacing wildly, snapping its jaws, deeply unsettled by something in the room. The climax of the evening approached as Lord Nathaniel took the center stage, raising a silver-encrusted goblet. "A toast," Nathaniel projected, his voice echoing through the silent ballroom. "To our Alpha King, and his unexpected bride. May the moon goddess bless this union with the strength our empire requires." Waiters in crisp white uniforms circulated the room, handing out delicate crystal coupes filled with a rare, deep red vintage wine. A waiter with slightly trembling hands offered a tray to Alexander and Alara. Alexander took a glass, his eyes fixed sharply on Nathaniel. Alara reached for hers. As her fingers brushed the crystal stem, a scent hit her like a physical blow. Beneath the heavy, robust notes of the fermented grapes and the subtle spices of oak and blackberry, There was a sharp, acrid chemical tang. It was incredibly faint, masked brilliantly by the vintage, but Alara had spent 6 years managing the Blackwood Pack's pharmaceutical inventory, Aconitum napellus, refined, concentrated wolfsbane, lethal to werewolves in high doses, causing respiratory failure and cardiac arrest within minutes. Her wolf roared a deafening, ancient sound that seemed to shatter the mental barriers inside her mind. Just as Alexander raised the glass to his lips, Alara moved with a speed that shocked even the king. She struck his wrist, hard. The crystal goblet flew from his hand, shattering against the polished marble floor. The dark red wine spilled like fresh blood across the white stone. The ballroom erupted in gasps. Guards immediately placed their hands on their holstered weapons. Vivian, standing near the front of the crowd, let out a dramatic, mocking sigh. "Really, Your Grace?" Vivian sneered loudly. "Is this how the uneducated behave in your former pack? Throwing tantrums and destroying priceless vintages?" Alexander froze, his golden eyes dropping to the shattered glass and then snapping to Alara, demanding an explanation before he unleashed his wrath on the entire room. Alara didn't back down. The heat in her blood reached a boiling point, and suddenly, a wave of pure, unadulterated alpha pressure exploded from her small frame. It wasn't the terrifying, crushing weight of Alexander's aura. It was older, deeper. It smelled of ancient earth and untamed lightning. The effect was instantaneous. Several of the aristocratic elites, including Vivienne, stumbled backward, their hands flying to their throats as they were forced to bow their heads in involuntary submission. Alexander stared at her, his jaw dropping a fraction of an inch in stunned realization. The Hayes bloodline. She wasn't a low-ranking commoner. She was the descendant of the original, ancient, Luna bloodline, a lineage thought to be extinct for centuries, completely suppressed by the trauma and abuse of her childhood. Until now. "No one touches that wine," Alara commanded, her voice ringing out with an absolute, undeniable authority that silenced the entire hall. She turned her blazing gaze to the waiter who had served them, who was now trembling violently, slowly backing toward the exit. "Guard the doors," Alara barked. Harrison moved before Alexander even had to give the order, tackling the waiter to the ground and pinning his arms. Alara knelt gracefully in her velvet gown, ignoring the shock of the onlookers. She dipped 2 fingers into the spilled puddle of wine and brought it close to her nose, confirming her suspicion. She stood up, her eyes locking directly onto Lord Nathaniel, who had suddenly gone remarkably pale. "Concentrated aconitum," Alara announced, her voice echoing in the dead silent room. "A lethal dose of wolfsbane, masked by the tannins of the wine. It takes a highly skilled chemist to synthesize it, without ruining the liquid's viscosity." She took a slow, deliberate step toward Nathaniel and Vivienne. "And it takes a desperate, foolish traitor to try and assassinate the king on the night of his mate's presentation." Alexander's presence suddenly magnified, expanding to fill the room with a suffocating, murderous rage. The gold in his eyes turned completely black. He didn't look at the shattered glass. He looked at the terrified courtiers who had dared to plot against his life and underestimate his queen. "Harrison," the Alpha King growled, his voice a promise of absolute carnage. "Lock down the estate. No one leaves this ballroom alive until I have a confession." The heavy mahogany doors of the grand ballroom slammed shut with a finality that echoed like a gunshot. The rhythmic clack-clack of heavy deadbolts sliding into place triggered a wave of raw panic among the continent's most elite wolves. The sterling royal guard, moving with lethal synchronicity, formed an impenetrable perimeter, their hands resting ominously on their tactical holsters. Alexander Sterling was no longer a polished CEO or a dignified monarch. He was the apex predator of North America, and someone had just tried to poison his fated mate on her coronation night. The gold in his eyes had been entirely swallowed by a violent, abyssal black, his claws fully extended, tearing through the sleeves of his custom midnight blue tuxedo jacket. The oppressive weight of his alpha aura slammed into the room, dropping dozens of aristocratic courtiers straight to their hands and knees in the spilled champagne and shattered glass. Harrison dragged the trembling waiter to the center of the room, forcing him onto his knees before the king and queen. The man was weeping freely, his uniform stained with sweat and the dark red wine. Alexander took a slow, deliberate step toward the assassin. The ambient temperature in the ballroom plummeted. "Who gave you the wolfsbane?" he growled, a sound so low it vibrated the crystal chandeliers above. The waiter choked on a sob, his eyes darting frantically toward the front row of the kneeling crowd, but he clamped his mouth shut. He was bound by an illicit blood oath, a magical compulsion that kept his tongue tied even under the threat of death. "He can't speak, Alexander," Alara said softly. She stepped past the king. The terrifying, murderous aura radiating from Alexander didn't touch her. Instead, it seemed to wrap around her like a protective cloak. Alara knelt gracefully in her velvet gown, coming face to face with the terrified assassin. She reached out and gently took the man's trembling hands, turning his palms upward. "Look at his fingertips," Alara instructed, her voice calm and clinical, carrying perfectly across the silent room. "The cuticles are stained with a faint, yellowish-brown residue. It's a chemical burn specific to handling raw aconitum root without proper filtration gear. He didn't just serve the poison, he synthesized it." She met the waiter's terrified gaze, unleashing a focused wave of her newly awakened Hayes bloodline aura. It was ancient, pure, and overwhelming, a maternal, commanding pressure that cut straight through the dark magic of his blood oath. "I know you were forced into this," Alara said, her tone a dangerous blend of empathy and absolute authority. "I can see the bruising on your wrists. Someone threatened your family to make you brew this. Tell me who it was, and the king will protect your bloodline. Stay silent, and you will die for their cowardice." The waiter gasped, the dark compulsion breaking under the sheer ancient purity of Alara's Luna command. He raised a shaking, stained finger and pointed directly at Lord Nathaniel Croft. "Lord Croft," the waiter wept. "He held my daughter in the southern cells. He provided the laboratory. But the raw root, it came from her." His finger shifted, pointing squarely at Vivian Kensington, whose pale face had just drained of all remaining color. The ballroom erupted into a cacophony of gasps and terrified whispers. Vivian scrambled backward, her silk heels slipping on the polished marble. "Lies!" she shrieked, pointing a manicured finger at Alara. "This feral street rat orchestrated this. She is trying to eliminate the true noble houses to secure her illegitimate claim. Alexander, you cannot believe this peasant over your own counsel." Alexander didn't yell. He didn't have to. He simply turned his head, and the silence that instantly fell over the room was absolute. "Harrison," Alexander commanded, his voice cold and devoid of mercy. The beta moved with terrifying speed. Before Nathaniel could even attempt to shift, Harrison's boot slammed into the back of the elder's knees, forcing him to the floor. 2 guards immediately seized Vivienne by the arms, lifting her off her feet as she thrashed and screamed obscenities. "For 3 years the Kensington family has attempted to place a puppet on my throne," Alexander stated, walking slowly toward the disgraced nobles. "You thought by eliminating me tonight, in the chaos of a newly claimed mate, you could seize the Eastern Territories. You vastly underestimated my intelligence, Nathaniel, and you vastly underestimated the woman standing beside me." Alexander looked back at Alara, the abyssal black in his eyes receding just enough to let a ring of proud molten gold shine through. "Alara Hayes is not a peasant," Alexander announced to the entire court, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "She carries the blood of the first Lunas. She spotted a chemical assassination that bypassed my entire royal security detail. She broke a blood oath with a single command. She is your true queen." He turned back to the traitors. "Lord Nathaniel, you are stripped of your titles, your lands, and your rank. You will spend the rest of your miserable life in the silver-lined cells of Rikers. Vivienne, your family's assets are hereby seized by the crown. You are banished to the northern wastes. If you ever cross the Canadian border again, you will be hunted for sport." The guards dragged the screaming Vivienne and the silent, broken Nathaniel out of the ballroom. As the heavy doors closed behind them, the oppressive tension in the room finally snapped. One by one, the elite alphas, the wealthy courtiers, and the hardened generals did not wait for an order. They looked at Alara, the orphaned nurse from the rugged mountains, standing tall and radiant in midnight blue velvet, and they dropped to one knee. They bowed their heads, exposing their necks in the ultimate display of absolute, unquestioning loyalty. They were not bowing out of fear of the king's wrath. They were bowing in profound reverence to the queen. Alexander stepped up behind Alara, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her back flush against his chest. He buried his face in her dark hair, inhaling her scent of rain and mountain pine. "You magnificent, terrifying creature," Alexander whispered against her ear, a rough smile playing on his lips. "You saved my life." Alara leaned back into his solid embrace, a genuine, radiant smile finally breaking across her face as she looked out over her new court. "I told you, Alexander," she murmured softly. "I'm a nurse. It's my job to keep you alive. From the blood-soaked dirt of the Blackwood Pack to the glittering, treacherous marble of the Sterling estate, Alara Hayes had navigated a brutal gauntlet of survival. The ultimatum that was meant to break her spirit, a forced breeding to a cruel enforcer, had instead been the catalyst that ignited her ancient, dormant bloodline. She was no longer a discarded asset or a helpless victim. She was the most powerful Luna Queen the modern era had ever witnessed. Beside her stood Alexander Sterling, a ruthless alpha king whose entire world had been irrevocably altered by the fierce, clinical precision and undeniable grace of his fated mate. Together, they purged the Sterling court of its venomous rot, ushering in a new reign of unyielding justice and fierce devotion. The pack had threatened to choose her fate, but in the end, Alara had claimed the throne, the king, and her own destiny.